Are we live?
You're live now.
Good evening. And Chris, can you see us? So let me know, but we're going to welcome everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Cancer Education Series. I'm Dick Deming, Medical Director of Mercy One Cancer Center, founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. And our Cancer Education Series is a collaboration with Mercy Cancer Center and Above and Beyond Cancer. And it's brought to you in part by a grant from the Iowa Cancer Consortium. And we're all in for a treat this evening. We have Professor Brooke Kowalke from Creighton University with us today. Brooke grew up in California. She got her undergraduate degree in English at UC Irvine and her master's and PhD in English at the University of Washington. And Brooke has been at Creighton University for the last 17 years. She is the assistant professor of English and medical humanities at Creighton. We're going to talk a little bit about what medical humanities are. And then Brooke is giving us a talk tonight that I'm really excited about. It's called Bearing Witness, where rupture, beauty, and grace meet. And with that, I'd like to welcome you, Brooke. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much to you, Dr. Deming, and to the Above and Beyond Cancer group for inviting me to speak with you all tonight. I'm excited to be here. So, shall I jump in?
I'll let you. Yes, you can.
Okay.
You can run with it. Brooke is going to give a little bit of a presentation with some slides, and then we'll come back together and have a conversation about your presentation.
Okay. So hopefully you can see my slide now. Is that? I can't see it.
I can. Let me bring it forward.
For whatever reason. Okay.
So there it is.
Is that showing? Okay.
I can see it. Yes.
I can't see any of you. I can't see you anymore. So give me an audio cue if something's going wrong.
I will for sure.
But as you said, kind of the way that I'm framing what I can bring to us tonight is through the lens of bearing witness, where beauty, rupture, and grace meet. And this picture here is one that's special to me. This is me and Grace, who you will learn more about momentarily. So you already covered this, but just a little bit about me. I started off as a bio pre-med student at UC Irvine, minoring in English. And then in my senior year, decided I did not, in fact, want to be a physician, even though I loved the life sciences, and changed entirely to English. So after graduation, I decided that if I could be a college student forever, that would be a great deal. So I decided to go get my PhD, ended up studying early modern English literature at the University of Washington, and then came to Creighton in 2004. When I arrived at Creighton, I was hired to do transatlantic literature. So looking at the connection between what is now the United States and England. So I taught pirate literature and Shakespeare, some early American literature, transatlantic travel literature. So that was kind of my former life in some ways. And then major life change with becoming a mother, 3 kiddos, Miles in 2014. Grace was born in 2016, and then Greta came along in 2017. And today's story is really about Grace, who's here in the upper right. So when I was pregnant with Grace, at our 20-week anatomy scan, they noted some anomalies, and we learned that she had a congenital heart defect, a VSD, that, as everyone put it at the time, was if you were going to have a heart defect, that was the one to have. Fairly straightforward in the world of heart defects. And so we were followed by maternal fetal medicine, by cardiology, we had kind of an immediate entry into a more complex care situation than we had experienced with Miles. Um, and we're, ready for what congenital heart defect would bring us. But then when Grace was born, when she was 48 hours old, we got the diagnosis of trisomy 18, so a chromosomal um, defect that meant she had 3 copies of that 18th chromosome, and is often associated with not even surviving to birth. And then a lot of times, kiddos with trisomy 18 do not survive past the first year, if they even survive a few days or weeks. So, of course, we turned to Dr. Google and found nothing good there. Um, Lots of talk about how she would never know us, how she wouldn't recognize us, a lot of things about what she would never do. Um, so our world was turned upside down pretty immediately. But at the same time, we had this precious girl in our arms, pictured there, giving us a good yawn. Um, and undeniably kind of grateful to have her, even as we were struggling with a difficult diagnosis and prognosis. And I found myself in that moment turning, as an English professor, I was turning to literature. And one of my graduate school friends sent me the book, The Still Point of the Turning World by Emily Rapp, in which she writes about her son's diagnosis with Tay Sachs disease, and his kind of eventual death. Um, and I learned there about the idea of anticipatory grief. Kind of, I had Grace in my arms, but I was already sort of grieving um, the possibility that she wouldn't stay with us as long as we, of course, hoped she would. Um, and Emily Rapp talks about that in ways that I think are really powerful. Um, at one point early in her book, she says, to prepare throughout a child's whole life for the loss of that boy or that girl, and then to live with it takes a new ferocity, a new way of thinking, a new animal. And I think those sorts of things really resonated with me as I recognized that um, the transformation that I was undergoing was really significant, um, in a way that kind of motherhood itself transformed me, and then being mother to a medically complex child with a life limiting diagnosis transformed me even more. So I found myself turning to my English major skills and also being grateful for some science background as I was thrust into the hospital environment. And I learned that being able to tell Grace's story, to tell our story in a compelling way, that ensured that she was seen as a whole person who was worthy of care, despite what textbooks might have said. A lot of kiddos with trisomy 18 are refused care and intervention. And we were very fortunate not to have that experience. But that's what I was kind of, working with, was that narrative that she did not necessarily kind of automatically receive the care that another infant might. And so I also turned to writing. I wrote to cope with everything that was going on, as well as to inform kind of our family and friends and loved ones. And so I spent a lot of time on Caring Bridge, posting almost daily updates. Um, I was introduced to the concept of bearing witness towards the end of Grace's life by one of the chaplains there at Children's Hospital here in Omaha. But I realize now, looking back, that anticipatory grief was part of the story, but bearing witness to Grace's life was a really big part of it too. That trying to see her life from the moment it began with intention and purpose, to open the windows onto the unknown, as Maria Arman says, that was another really big part of the story that we were creating together. So here's another picture that I really love of Grace, and some art that she and Miles created together just a few days before she died. It's Miles' handprint making the O and Grace's footprint making the V. So as I kind of have been thinking about and was thinking about this, I've been really influenced by a scholar named Anne Jurasik, whose book Illness is Narrative I want to talk a little bit about here. She says writers are pressed by circumstances to address how the experience of illness causes fixed ideas and narratives to fall away. Through the act of writing, these writers recreate, at least temporarily, a more coherent sense of themselves and their lives. When writers or readers hold both rupture and beauty in view at the same time, understanding them to exist in relationship, then they see from a reparative position. And when she's talking about this reparative position, she's drawing on the work of another scholar named Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. And she writes about how this reparative work is likeliest to occur near the boundary of what a writer can't figure out how to say readily. Um, that writing and reading become acts of discovery from which understanding emerges, and that we spend time exploring the edges of our own understanding when we engage in this reparative work. So, this has been really important to me as I think about how literature and how writing and how reading um, play such a major role in thinking about our story with Grace. Um, Another kind of major influence in terms of my thinking about bearing witness is Rita Sharon, who is, huge figure in founding the idea of narrative medicine. And she says that when we bear witness, we participate in what she calls the active transport of love. She goes on to say that once we experience our capacity to witness the plight of another through loving commitment, we have at our disposal this permeability to other suffering, this receptivity toward the words of others, this generosity of self in the service of another self trying to be heard. And that just really resonates for me with our experience with Grace and for what was created um, kind of out of her story, is this real shift in receptivity, and a hopeful shift in terms of a generosity of self, in service of that other self trying to be heard. Um, so, those three kind of terms that I put in the title, rupture, thinking about Grace's life limiting diagnosis, experiencing with her, walking her through, and watching her have to go alone through open heart surgery, spending long weeks in the hospital, dealing with grief after she was no longer here with us. But then in that rupture, the beauty of experiencing just the inherent value of her life, of the time that we got together as a family that really brought home the fact that nothing is promised to any of us. Um, the snuggles, the inside jokes. She was had amazing timing when it came to passing gas around her doctors, and it was just kind of fun to enjoy things that were so typically infanty, even though so much that we were experiencing was not typical. And just an overwhelming sense of love in our family, love that we experienced from our community, and family and friends who supported us. And then, of course, Grace, our daughter, who we named Grace before we knew her diagnosis. My husband proposed the name minutes before we went into the OR for our planned C-section. Um, Grace, in terms of our sustaining faith that was deepened as we had to trust God in new ways. And then Grace and her ongoing role in our family, and in our continued growth as people. And for me, a lot of changes in my professional world as well. So after Grace's death, I was really just at a loss of how to move forward. And I knew that I wanted to tell her story. I knew I wanted to write more about her story. Um, And I didn't know what to do. I thought, well, all of that will have to wait until I retire, and I've got a ways to go. Um, and then in a conversation with our dean, Dr. Bridget Keegan, she encouraged me to say, no, like, this is what Creighton is about. Um, this is your mission, this is your calling. Tell the story now. And so in that moment, I was shifting focus towards how I would do that. Um, and then, kind of simultaneously, the Kingfisher Institute here at Creighton was being developed, which focuses on creating connections between the humanities and professional schools. And then the Creighton School of Medicine was also creating its new curriculum that integrates the medical humanities. So, looking at how the humanities um, can inform medical thinking and practice in some ways, and how medicine can help us see the humanities differently too. So, out of that grew some courses that I thought I would just introduce briefly here. The first course that I developed for the medical school is one that I co-designed and co-teach with palliative care physician Dr. Kate McKillop. She is someone who I reconnected with when she was doing her residency at Children's Hospital while Grace was inpatient. So she and I shared some pretty meaningful experiences there in terms of the bearing witness to Grace and her life. And so we co-designed that course in 2019 when the Creighton School of Medicine was implementing the new curriculum with an integrated approach to the medical humanities. So our goals in that course are to explore how the language we use to describe and address neurodiverse individuals, so those whose modes of cognition do not fit within a narrowly defined sense of what is typical, may reveal implicit or explicit biases. We try to investigate different approaches to neurodiversity that affirm whole and complex personhood. We really work to center the voices of members of the neurodiverse community. And then we also explicitly ask our students to try to bear witness to individuals on their own terms, reconceiving notions of quality of life in order to encompass a wide range of experiences and values. And that's, of course, we just started again our third round of teaching that class. We started on Monday, so this is very fresh, and we keep changing it. But I think we're getting closer to where we want to be. And then the other course that I've been teaching within the med school is called Bearing Witness: Memoirs of Dying, Death, and Grief. I designed that last year for fourth year medical students, and it's pretty compressed. We meet for 2 hours once a week for 4 weeks. And our goals are to think about what it means to bear witness and why that might matter to the students' role as physicians. Um, it's also an opportunity to get an inside look at various relationships to dying, death, and grief. The students in the class often talk about how they know and they encounter dying and death and grief, but it's not something that they've had a lot of time to think about, talk about, read about, and process. So it creates kind of a sacred space for them to do that. And then we also explore the genre of memoir itself, and they practice writing their own personal narratives and experience some of the, I don't know, healing power, I guess, of writing and telling their own stories. Um, so right now in this iteration of the class, we read That Good Night by Sunita Puri, who is a palliative care physician. We read The Bright Hour by Nina Riggs, who was a poet who wrote her memoir as she was dying of breast cancer. Once More We Saw Stars by Jason Green, telling the story of his daughter's death when she was, I think, 2 years old from just kind of a bizarre accident, um, but giving us a kind of underrepresented father's perspective on grief and child loss. And then A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, which is kind of a classic. Um, so those are the two courses that I'm mostly teaching in the medical school to medical students, and it's been a wonderful experience that I hope we can talk about some more. And then kind of currently, out of all of this, working on that memoir, currently thinking about it as Grace Notes: Lesson on Personhood, Parenthood, and Love. We are trying to develop a more robust offering of undergraduate medical humanities courses. So there's 4 of those that I've been working with, a composition course, um, a kind of core literature course, and then a couple courses for our majors. And then some courses within our brand new Masters in Medical Humanities. So we've got a lot happening here. And I think for me, that idea of bearing witness is sitting at the core of all of these. So I will stop that there, um, and try to get back to you. There we go.
There we go. And, well, first of all, thank you for sharing Grace's story.
Yeah.
Um, and I was going to ask you about the naming of Grace and how, just it moved me to know that Grace's name was chosen before, you knew exactly the type
Mhm.
of grace that she was going to provide you and your family
Absolutely.
with. And certainly a different journey than you had expected when
Mhm.
you were rolled into the operating room to bring Grace into the world.
Yep.
And how lovely that long after Grace's passing, she continues to teach
Yeah.
us and to inspire those of us who never had the chance to meet her in person.
Yeah. Thank you.
Obviously, part of what mortality is, or immortality is the idea that individuals who are gone can continue to inspire others
Mhm.
along the way.
Absolutely.
And the way that her life and death then changed the direction of what you have done. And
Mhm.
boy, look what is happening with medical humanities. So maybe let's start off just elaborating a little bit more about medical humanities. So as many people in the room and viewing may know, I attended Creighton Medical School. I graduated in 1980, so a long time ago. And up until just a year ago, the curriculum for medical school really hadn't changed for maybe 50 years.
Mhm.
It was the first 2 years, you do a lot of big auditorium classes and do all the sciences, and you do chemistry and biochemistry and physiology and pharmacology and anatomy, and then you don't really get to see patients till your third and fourth years. And the idea that humanities was going to be taught, it was no, like, you guys have all gone to college. You had humanities electives. This is in fact, I remember the dean saying, "This is live bullets from this point forward." To now, what has transpired in the new curriculum, where no longer are there big auditorium classes, they're all seminar
Mhm.
classes. Seeing patients starts in the first year,
Mhm.
and the realization that being a doctor, taking care of a patient, is a human being taking care of a human being. And if that's not humanity,
Absolutely.
uh, in the idea that we can become better doctors by
Mhm.
continuing to focus on humanities.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe tell us a little bit from your perspective now, as part of as the program got launched, and then being part of it and teaching
Mhm.
medical students humanities while they're in medical school. Uh, just reflect a bit on that idea of teaching medical humanities to medical students.
Yeah. It's been, I mean, first, just a real privilege to get to be part of that really formative time for them. And it's been especially exciting to be able to engage with students in the first year as well as in the fourth year. And then I get to see how different those 2 years are. Um, and so I think in that first year, students are so overwhelmed with all of the science that they are, learning and memorizing, and their units move so quickly. And so that's been an eye opener. But it feels like when we enter that classroom, we have had to work on creating some space for them to shift gears from memorization to um, kind of thinking in a different way about texts and about human experiences. Um, but we really realized too, like they have a hunger for it. They want to be able to talk about their patients or their future patients or their own experiences in narrative ways. Like they want the story, even though they're largely focused on so many, memorizing systems and all of that stuff that I don't know about. So that's been a big part of it. And then we've also really kind of emphasized throughout those courses that one of our hopes is that they will begin to develop and kind of cultivate some coping mechanisms for themselves. So, ways to process the things that they're learning, ways to process the questions they're confronting, and kind of starting to more regularly engage in written reflections and discussions that might help them process some of that. So, yeah, I don't know. I can tell you more about some of that, or I'll let you.
Yeah, maybe we'll get into really the meat of what you were talking about, bearing witness, and several things I thought about. One, you quoted some researchers and also Rita Sharon, who's really came up with this concept of narrative medicine, that even in the doctor-patient relationship, we get into this bearing witness, and that, as you know, the typical encounter with the doctor and patient is that this patient begins to speak, and within less than 30 seconds, the doctor interrupts the patient, and the traditional is, okay, we don't have a lot of time, it's just the facts, ma'am, just the facts, and we ask the who, what, where, and how, and but the narrative medicine is really, well, let's get to know each other as human beings and what's important.
Yeah.
And that not just listening, but actually also asking questions and listening and inquiring compassionately to learn about the patient. And I always tell the students that I have the opportunity to teach that if it's going to be a true relationship, it does have to be both ways. And you can't think that you're just a compassionate listener and only get something. You also have to share. So whether it's where did you grow up? And I grew up in South Dakota. You share a little bit. Obviously, there's appropriate boundaries, but the importance of that, getting that authentic relationship going from the very beginning. And as a cancer doctor, it is. Death is in the room from the very beginning, and the idea that this is a very significant relationship that it may last the life of the patient. It's important to get the relationship correct, and the narrative, the bearing witness is part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we spend time, particularly in the narratives of neurodiversity class, talking about asking questions. Exactly what you're saying. Kate often will share some of her palliative care techniques with them, and asking patients to define their own idea of what getting better is or what better looks like, what a good day looks like for them. And then a lot of times when we're reading narratives or watching TED Talks or whoever we're engaging with in class, we'll ask students to kind of watch with those kinds of questions in mind. Because we obviously can't create that two-way relationship in the same way with a text. But yeah.
And another thing that came to mind as you were speaking is, and I don't know who said this, you might know, but there's this concept of how do I know what I think until I hear what I say? And if you're talking about narratives and writing your own personal narratives, and even at the end of the day of having seen many patients, you're quickly processing things, but sometimes it takes this act of reflection where you really learn what you got out of this bearing witness, and that taking the time to either speak it in a conversation in a class that you might be having, or taking time to reflect on it in a journal or in writing, that we really sometimes gloss over the significance of what we might just have experienced if we don't take time to reflect.
Agreed, agreed. And I feel like for myself, we're almost 5 years on from Grace's death. And I am realizing and learning new things about our experience, which was ultimately, about 5 months long. And now I've spent almost 5 years thinking about that and reflecting on it and bearing witness to what we experienced during that time. And I feel like it just keeps unfolding. And so um, I typically will share some of that in our classrooms as well to help students know where I'm coming from, why I'm engaged in this kind of work, and also to be potentially a resource for doctors in training to be able to speak with, from a patient perspective or from a caregiver, a patient parent perspective, to be able to ask some questions that might seem scary or difficult when they're kind of actually in the room.
You talked about two different types of writing that you are using in your courses. Obviously, there's the memoir, which is nonfiction, although maybe have you comment a little bit about the idea of creative nonfiction, the factual versus more reflective and maybe your definition of memoir, and then also literature.
Sure.
And maybe before I throw out some titles of both that have moved me and have influenced me, maybe have you comment on the difference you think, first of all, what is a memoir as opposed to a nonfiction book, and how do you define the term memoir? And then secondly, comment on maybe what you think are the differences of what you can gain from reading a novel that might have some personal information in it versus a memoir.
Those are great questions. I think for me, the memoir, and people, will define this differently, but for me, a true story based in reflection upon one's own experiences, um, but not necessarily the sort of true that a biography would be or an autobiography where we're digging up archival data and making sure you can verify every single fact you include. But instead, kind of an understanding that these are a person's own reflections, recollections, and attempts at making sense of their experiences. And so you may not be able to verify every single fact in a memoir, but the aim is to reflect on um, what those experiences have revealed, I guess, is how I would characterize that. And so one reason I really like teaching memoirs, especially in that fourth year med student class, but also to the in the narratives of neurodiversity and one class, is it allows students to see patient perspectives that might not be available to them in the clinical setting, because these are patients who are telling their stories um, in a obviously much lengthier way than they get to do in the clinic, and reflecting on things that might not come up in clinic. And so a lot of students comment on, like with the Bright Hour with Nina Riggs, just that the ways that her diagnosis affects her relationship with her children, that's not always something that they would have guessed or would encounter in the clinical setting, but that gets a lot of space in her memoir, that they appreciate getting to engage with. As far as like a novel or short story, I think there, you have the difference that you can construct that story however you want to. You aren't bound by what actually happened. And so I just finished teaching a great novel called Transcendent Kingdom by Ya Jossi. And it's about a young Black woman who is doing her PhD in neuroscience. And it starts off with a sense of herself as a objective scientist, that this is why she's gone into science. It's objective and concrete. But as the story unfolds, it turns out that her mother has experienced a couple of very deep depressions, and her brother died of a heroin overdose, after being prescribed um, opioids after an athletic injury. And so her science that is objective is actually all about trying to figure out um, neurological responses to reward and restraint, and trying to intervene in the narrative that she's seen in her brother and mother's lives. Now, as a novel, she can make all of that happen, right? She's grounding it in research on current studies in neuroscience. But as a novelist, she can make all those threads work very neatly together in a way that they may not in, real life. And so that's kind of a fun part of teaching fiction, is that, that craftedness, and the constructed nature of the narrative allows us to get at the heart of some big questions sometimes in a way that memoirs also do, but in a different way.
So let's talk about memoirs, and you mentioned several, and I recently read The Bright Hour, and one that wasn't on your list, but I always think of in parallel because their spouses have come together now, is When Breath Becomes Air, by Paul Kalanithi and Kalanithi. What I really love about his is obviously you also get the doctor perspective. He is a doctor and a patient. And so in part of the book is he's going through his time as an English major and then in medical school and then senior chief resident in neurosurgery. You get some encounters where he is the doctor and reflecting on his relationship with his patients, but then obviously most of the book is he is the patient, but he still is a doctor. And from a point of view of me as a reader being a doctor or a medical student reading that book, kind of getting a glimpse of both worlds in one book.
And one of the things that really strikes me about that book, which I've gotten to teach to undergrads, but I haven't yet used it in the med classes, is the moment when he goes to get the x-ray of his back, and they don't see cancer, if I'm remembering. It's been a couple years, and he knows in his mind that this x-ray is not the best way to identify cancer. His doctor mind says, I know this, but his patient mind says, I'm going to defer to the authority of the physician in the room. And to me, that has been such a powerful moment, that he's able to reveal the way those roles have such predetermined narratives, and how important it is for us to disrupt those narratives too, right? That it's okay for this to be a learning together that respects the expertise that each person in the room possesses, but doesn't just, he has that red flag that comes up in his head. He's like, I don't know if this is right, but he doesn't push it because he doesn't want to disrespect the authority in the room, which is so fascinating to me.
It is. I think, 20 years before that wouldn't have happened, because it used to be that we as docs in the hospital would just walk down to the radiology and just have them do it, and it would be off the records and you would just get it done. Now with electronic medical records and ordering and reconciliation, you can't do that. So you have to get things officially ordered and done. And so he was in medicine at a time where things are done computerized and orders have to be done before the machine will turn on, because in the olden days when I was doing it, he would have just maybe gone down and got an x-ray himself without even getting another doctor involved.
Oh, wow.
So I'm not saying that was a good thing, but that was just a perspective that I talked with because he's a very intelligent guy, and he really didn't think that the doctor that was ordering the test was really ordering the right test, but he agreed to,
Yeah.
Go with that.
Which I think is
Yeah.
powerful for, this is one thing we talk a lot about in our classes too, for students to really think about that doctor-patient relationship and the power that the physician does possess. Even if they're not trying to, that's the social role, I mean, right now that's being challenged in some unfortunate ways. But I think, we see that a lot. And so for them to realize that it might take a little extra to really create that trust between themselves and the patient is really an interesting moment as well.
And his wife is a physician as well, and
Yeah.
so they that's an interesting dynamic. I think one of my favorite parts of that whole book is the epilogue that Lucy writes.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful, and
Mhm.
I have shared that with many patients. There's the way that she very beautifully talks about that her love for her husband doesn't die, and that even after he has died, that she still has this love
Mhm.
that provides her pleasure, sustenance,
Mhm.
and even as she goes on with her life, and even if the grieving is over, she still has this sense of love that's a positive, enduring,
Mhm.
very visceral emotion that she retains.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And I think that story too, part of that center is as he's facing what he then by then knows, I think, is a terminal diagnosis, um, that they decide to go ahead with having a child. And I think that to me is another one of those moments of thinking about bearing witness where they're looking at their situation so intentionally, and with a lot of kind of thoughtfulness and making a very difficult decision, knowing that their daughter will experience loss, almost immediately, very young. When he dies, she will always grow up with that loss, but she also grows up with the gift of A, being here, and B, knowing that her dad chose to love her, even though he knew he was gonna have to say goodbye so soon, and that her mom made that choice too. Like, it's just a really beautiful, I feel like that idea of the rupture and the beauty, that there's this beautiful moment and this beautiful child that comes out of this kind of terrible rupture in their life and their relationship. So a lot going on there for sure. It's a great book. Now I gotta go reread it.
Yes, yes. So we'll jump around here, but let's talk about novels. So,
Yeah.
what novels would you say kind of are novels that you might approach the same way you would approach the memoir in terms of the topic?
Mhm.
And we're talking about death
Mhm.
from illness,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Um, I think the one that I have turned to most often isn't actually a novel, but a play. Wit. I don't know if you, yeah, I'm sure you
Mhm.
know. Yeah, Wit. And I think that's one of my favorites in telling the story again of the English professor who brings her poetry and her John Donne studies to her experience of, I think, stage 4 ovarian cancer, if I'm remembering correctly. Um, and again, like the narrative is created so that those connections are made. But that's one that I really enjoy because she has to confront her process of dying. She has to confront her objectification. She doesn't always have the best experience in the hospital. Um, she confronts, what she knew through reading. The line in Donne's Holy Sonnet, "Death, thou shalt not die," and she talks about the semicolon and how it's not a period and a full stop. It's not a comma. It's not that close, but like the semicolon, it's like there's a separation and union together, if I'm remembering correctly, or maybe it's a comma. Now I'm doubting myself. But in any case, she pays attention to the punctuation, right? And how it creates kind of this relationship between death and then the death, thou shalt die. Um, and I think that's so interesting how she kind of brings those things that were hypothetical to her into the very real situation of her death and dying. And then, she spends a lot of time on stage alone. And I think she's left with the literature as her kind of companion. Um, I don't know, it just resonates in a lot of ways, I think, with how literature and the humanities can help us in those kind of very difficult moments, but also kind of the real need for that human connection with her care providers and with kind of family and friends to support her along the way. So that's one text I really admire. That's fiction. Um, Trying to think about another novel that I've dealt with death and dying. I've mostly been focusing on
Yeah.
the true stories.
Well, let me share with you one, but first we also might get into poetry because there's this
Yeah,
poetry, and we could have a whole conversation on the role that poetry
yeah,
plays in helping people through difficult times.
yeah.
So we might get into that, but so I'm sure you're familiar with Wallace Stegner.
Hmm.
Have you ever read?
Hmm.
So he has a couple of novels that touch on it. Probably the more famous of the two that touch on death and it's from cancer is Crossing to Safety,
Mm.
which is the two couples, the men are college professors in Wisconsin.
Hmm.
But the one I love was actually written in 1969, and it's called All the Little Live Things. Are
Hmm.
you familiar with the novel? So the protagonist is somewhat autobiographical. It's a 64-year-old editor who's just retired, and he and his wife are living up in the mountains above Stanford, and a couple moves in across the road. They've got an acreage, and it's a young couple, and you learn that she is pregnant and has
Oh,
cancer.
wow.
It's a bit of a race, and so this is written during the hippie era, and she just reflects all of the positivity
Mm.
of the interconnectedness of nature, and that everything has a reason and comes together, and we're all part of it. And he's more out there trying to spray insecticides and pesticides in his garden growing and kill the gophers, and she's like
Sure.
just all the little live things.
Mm.
And in the end, she does die of her
Mm.
cancer. And in the epilogue, I love epilogues, he, really reflects on the different
Mm.
philosophies of life.
Mm.
And that even after her death, he still can't accept that there isn't evil in the world and that
Mm.
that contributes to cancer and death. And but then it comes to this beautiful ending where he said, "Would I give it all up? Would I have given all those days that I had with her?" And he loves her like a daughter, to have avoided this pain and
Mm.
suffering. Not on your life.
Yeah.
I shall richer all my life for this sorrow.
Mm.
And the idea that in time we reflect on the emotional intensity of even witnessing a death over time adds emotional intensity to our life
Absolutely.
and enriches our life
Hmm.
by being loved someone so deeply
Hmm.
that you miss them.
Yeah, and an attention, I think, like you said, to all those small things, and would you give that up? Absolutely not. I think the love that we experience, particularly um, in those intensified moments, absolutely changes us. And ideally, I think it doesn't have to go this way, but I think this is where things like the humanities and art can help. Ideally, they go towards looking for beauty and looking for the gifts and looking for the places um, where that love continues to shine through. Um, as obviously not the only choice. I mean, I think that it can also, um, harden us to the world for fear of being wounded again, and that's understandable as well. But I think that's one thing that I really appreciate about stories that deal with um, hard things that are hard things. And as the chaplain that we kind of spent a lot of time with in the hospital reminded me, this is not a good thing. Like, this is a hard, bad thing. Um, but we can also keep our eyes open for the beauty, for the gifts, for the love, for the good, um, even while allowing the bad thing to be a bad, hard thing. And I think sitting in that tension, I'm really drawn to narratives that ask us to sit in the tension and the mystery without trying to make it nice and neat. And it sounds like that's when I need to read because it sounds like it's doing exactly that, sitting in that kind of messy middle and the complexity of life and loving um, amidst kind of a world full of difficult, hard things.
Yes.
So,
So we do have about 10 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about poetry. And
yeah.
so you mentioned wit, which brings poetry into the
Hmm.
narrative, dying and
Hmm.
plays a role. Why is an English major? What is it about poetry that you think can provide such solace and help really promote reflection
Hmm.
and help us through difficult times?
We were just talking about this in our Intro to Medical Humanities course. And we spent some time really thinking about the way that poetry asks us to be fully immersed in it because it requires such work. Um, we have to often um, kind of engage with poetry on a couple of levels. I think on the one level, there's just kind of an aesthetic beauty to the sounds that poetry creates. Poets are great at attending to the way words sound. And so reading poetry out loud is always something I encourage. Um, because it's a different experience. Like listening to it is a different experience than just reading it silently to ourselves. And there's just that aesthetic pleasure of the sound in a lot of cases. And then I think also it's so compressed in its meaning that we have to work hard to figure out what's going on. And so I think there's a gift in that it causes us to immerse ourselves in its experience. And so, whatever that is, it takes us out of ourselves for a moment and asks us to be kind of fully engaged in a number of ways um, within the world of the poem. Um, and of course, poets do such a nice job with images as well that I think ask us to see the world in new ways, like you were mentioning, with the little live things. Um, so I don't know. I think those are my takes on why poetry um, really is such a unique experience, I guess, and can help us in those difficult times.
So I share
I'd be
poems.
curious,
Yeah,
yeah, your take on that too.
I agree, and it points at things without having to be just absolutely direct, and so it allows you to bring your own personal experience
Hmm.
into the poem or use the poem to reflect on your personal experience. Sometimes if a memoir is too specific about age and
Sure.
gender and the storyline, it is less universal. So the pointing at things is more universal than
Hmm.
just describing them.
Yeah.
Um, and so I share poems with patients. Not the first time I get to meet a patient, but after I've established a relationship,
Sure.
there will be some poems that are at the right time to share with patients.
Mm.
And when I have medical students on rotations, their final exam with me is they have to bring a poem
Oh,
to read on the final
I
day.
love it.
Not to write, but a poem to read. Do you have a poem at your fingertips you want to
Oh,
share?
I wish I did. I do not. I wish I did. Um, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm terrible at memorizing
Well, when
things.
you do a rotation with me, I give you a week's notice.
I'm glad. I have some poetry that I'm working on teaching this semester, but I don't quite yet have it sorted out. Um, but it's a really interesting collection that uh inhabits different persona from the Virginia colony for epileptic and feeble-minded. So she really engages with kind of eugenics debates and things like that through poetry. So it's fascinating, and I will recommend the collection, but I don't know that I have a favorite to
Okay,
read right
okay.
at the moment.
So one of my favorite poets, because it's just very accessible, it doesn't require lots of study, but is Mary Oliver. Familiar
Yeah,
with her? Yeah.
yeah.
So she has a poem called The Fourth Sign of the Zodiac.
Mm,
And the fourth sign of the zodiac is Cancer. And it
mm,
was the poem that she wrote after she was first diagnosed with cancer. So that
mm,
is a lovely poem written in 4 parts. And,
yeah,
it looks at it looks at many different perspectives of the journey through cancer,
yeah,
from shock and anger to acceptance to hope and everything in between in a beautiful way that only Mary Oliver could do. So I
yeah.
recommend that to you.
I will look at it. Absolutely. And it does bring to mind that I did teach this semester her poem The Rabbit. Um
I do
which
not know that one. I
Oh
will.
good, we'll trade favorite Mary Oliver poems
The
then.
rabbit. Okay.
Um so The Rabbit is about someone who encounters a dead rabbit and can't quite bring themselves to deal with the body, um, and watches it go through several days of decay, and eventually is able to bury it. And then, as they're wandering through the field one day, comes across a bird's nest, and the bird's nest is full of new chicks, and it's lined with the rabbit's fur. And so, a really beautiful meditation on death and the kind of continued gifts. Um, so, yes, okay, I will look up the fourth sign of the zodiac, and I will send you the rabbit.
I will. I've got her full collection. I will find the rabbit tonight and read it.
Perfect.
Well, Brooke, this has been wonderful. Again, thank you for you being here. Thank you for sharing Grace's story. How's your memoir coming along? Is that
Slowly, slowly,
okay?
but it's coming. Yes, yeah.
Good. Well, I hope it brings you comfort in
Thank
sharing
you.
uh, Grace with us, and we've learned from Grace, and I'm just so thrilled to have the connection with Creighton, and I look forward to being able to learn more about all of the programming that's being done, and also sharing some of what I learned through your courses with my patients and with the students that I'm teaching here at Des Moines.
Likewise, and it's wonderful. Thank you for all of your support of what's going on here. And sharing your stories too, because I think that helps us who are not medical professionals have some more ideas about what we need to be bringing to the classroom. So thanks so much.
Well, very good. This has been a wonderful conversation. And let me just say goodbye to our audience. Thank you, everyone, for being here. If you would like to watch this again, it will be available on the Mercy One website, and it will also be available for viewing at the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel. So please come and join us again next week. Thanks again, Brooke. Have a
Thank
great evening.
you. Good night. Bye bye.
Good night.